In the mid-1980s, in a small town in South Carolina, life moved at a measured pace. The roads were narrow. The fields stretched wide beyond the last row of houses. And nightfall brought a darkness that felt complete. Streetlights were sparse. Neighbors were not within shouting distance. The horizon, especially after sunset, seemed to absorb sound. Inside one modest home lived a single mother and her 4 children. Money was limited. Space was shared. Responsibilities were divided early. The older children helped care for the younger ones when their mother worked. It was not an unusual arrangement for the time. Financial strain did not translate into instability. By all accounts, the household was structured, predictable, and closely bonded. In communities like this, doors were sometimes left unlocked. Children played outside until dusk. Parents worried about scraped knees more than strangers. The cultural landscape of the 1980s had not yet absorbed the wave of public fear surrounding child abduction that would intensify in the decades to come. There were missing children, yes, but the national conversation had not yet crystallized into the constant vigilance many families now consider routine. This setting matters, because when violence enters a chaotic space, it feels almost inevitable. When it enters a structured, ordinary household, it destabilizes something deeper. The power of this case lies not in spectacle, but in intrusion into a bedroom, into routine, into trust. On the morning in question, the disruption revealed itself quietly. The mother woke around 9. A 6-year-old daughter walked into her room and asked for cereal. It was an ordinary request. But when the mother stepped into the hallway, she noticed something that did not fit. The front door was open. The family dog, who usually remained outside at night, was running loose inside the house. Near a back window, a curtain rod lay on the floor. The protective screen had been removed. The house did not appear ransacked. There was no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, just small, specific displacements. And then the most important absence, her 4-year-old daughter was gone. The bed the child had slept in remained intact. The blankets were not torn away. There were no visible signs of struggle, just an empty space where a sleeping child had been. When asked what happened, the 6-year-old sibling described seeing a man with a beard and a wizard hat who had carried her sister away during the night. The description was unusual. It sounded almost fantastical. But children often encode memory in images. What she saw or believed she saw became the only narrative thread available in those first hours. The tone of that morning, in the record, is not chaotic. It is still controlled, confused. In 1986, the investigative tools available to rural departments were limited. DNA profiling was not yet widely used. Fingerprint databases were far less comprehensive than they are today. There was no Amber Alert system to broadcast information instantly across state lines. Departments outside major cities were often under-resourced, operating with small teams and long response times, and without a body, prosecutors faced a high evidentiary threshold before bringing charges. This case, then, is not only about an offender, it is about how a crime unfolds within the constraints of a particular era. It is about what evidence meant in 1986, what it could not yet prove, and how those structural limits shaped the trajectory of justice. To understand the psychological dimensions of what happened in that bedroom, we must first understand the environment around it, the cultural assumptions, the investigative boundaries, and the quiet spaces where certainty could not yet exist. Only within that framework does the intrusion make sense. When we analyze a case like this, The first responsibility is to separate what is documented from what is remembered, and what is remembered from what is inferred. Cold cases often blur those boundaries over time. Memory shifts, narratives harden. But the record, however incomplete, still offers structure. On the evening before the disappearance, nothing appeared out of place. The children were outside, playing in the yard as they often did during early summer. Their mother moved between tasks inside the house. Dinner was served. The family ate together. There were no reports of arguments, no unusual visitors, no disturbances that would later stand out in hindsight. One detail, however, deserves attention. That night, the usual sleeping arrangement changed. Jessica, the youngest, typically slept in her mother's bed, but her brother had an earache and was allowed to sleep there instead. As a result, Jessica went to bed with her sisters. It may seem minor, yet routine disruptions can create opportunity. Whether this change was observed by someone outside the household or simply coincidental, we cannot say. The record is silent on any confirmed surveillance. Still, timing raises questions. An offender entering a home and selecting a child from a shared bed suggests either prior knowledge of sleeping patterns or a willingness to adapt quickly in low light. We do not assume premeditation beyond the evidence, but the alignment between opportunity and intrusion invites examination. The confirmed physical evidence begins at the window. Investigators documented that the protective screen had been removed. A curtain rod lay displaced. A fingerprint was found on the exterior glass. Near the window, officers recovered a pack of cigarettes and several cigarette butts. Those details are not dramatic. They are specific. And specificity matters. From the 6-year-old sibling came additional testimony. She reported waking during the night and seeing a man with a beard wearing what she described as a wizard hat. She stated that he unplugged a fan and a nightlight before lifting Jessica, who was still asleep, and carrying her from the room. Child testimony requires careful handling. Young children often encode experience through imagery rather than taxonomy. A tall cowboy hat, seen briefly in dim light, could be interpreted as a wizard hat. We do not know what she truly saw. But what is psychologically relevant is this: she described a figure. She described specific actions, and she repeated those elements consistently. Consistency does not equal precision, but it suggests the memory was not entirely fabricated. The act of unplugging the fan and nightlight is behaviorally significant. It suggests attention to environmental control, reducing sound, minimizing light, decreasing the chance of waking others. That detail, if accurate, indicates calm execution. It may indicate planning rather than impulsive violence. There were no reports of adults awakening during the intrusion. No forced entry through the front door. No evidence of chaotic struggle. A sleeping child was removed from her bed without triggering household alarm. That level of quiet control matters. In the immediate aftermath, the mother contacted law enforcement. Officers searched the home and concluded that an abduction was plausible. The fingerprint was processed and entered into available databases. No match was found at the time. A recording device was placed on the family phone in anticipation of a ransom demand. No ransom call ever came. That absence becomes central to psychological interpretation. Kidnappings motivated by financial gain tend to involve communication. Demands are made, deadlines are set, leverage is exercised. In this case, there was silence, no call, no note, no negotiation. This behavioral pattern suggests an offender who did not intend transactional exchange. It shifts the psychological profile away from ransom-driven motives and towards something personal, predatory, or compulsive. It may indicate that the removal of the child itself was the objective. We begin, in this chapter, to see deviation from conventional kidnapping models. The crime was intimate in proximity, but detached in communication. And in that silence, the psychological direction of the case begins to change. When analyzing violent crime, it is essential to begin with the victim, not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a person. Jessica was 4 years old. She was asleep when she was taken. She depended entirely on the adults around her for safety, structure, and protection at that age. Resistance is minimal. Comprehension of danger is limited. A sleeping child does not anticipate threat from a victimology perspective. Age alone suggests vulnerability selection. It may indicate that the offender sought a target who could be removed quickly and quietly. The fact that she was taken from inside her bedroom adds a deeper layer. This was not a public abduction. It was not a moment of sudden opportunity in a parking lot or on a sidewalk. The offender crossed the physical and psychological threshold of a family's private space. That crossing matters. Entering a home at night carries inherent risk. Adults may awaken, neighbors may notice, dogs may bark. To proceed anyway suggests risk tolerance. It may indicate familiarity with the property. It may suggest confidence built from prior offenses, or it may reflect a personality structure that underestimates consequences. We do not know which applies here, but the choice to enter, rather than lure, suggests a desire for proximity and control. Turning to the family's response, the early days of the investigation reveal emotional escalation. The mother quickly voiced suspicion toward a former boyfriend. She expressed frustration toward law enforcement. At times, the tone between family and authorities became strained. It is important to approach that dynamic carefully. Grief often presents as anger. When information is scarce, distrust can grow. The absence of updates can feel like inaction. From the family's perspective, urgency is absolute. From an investigative standpoint, evidence must be verified before conclusions are drawn. Those two realities can collide. The record reflects tension between the mother and the sheriff's office. That strain may have complicated cooperation. It may have influenced communication flow. We cannot measure its exact impact, but we can acknowledge that investigative partnerships rely on trust, and trust is fragile under trauma. Months later, a new development emerged. A local man was arrested in connection with other crimes. His fingerprint matched the one found on the exterior glass of the bedroom window. He had previously worked on the property. He wore a beard and a tall hat. Consistent with the child's description, he had a history of break-ins and assault. From a behavioral standpoint, these elements suggest a pattern: willingness to enter occupied homes, mobility, escalation across offenses. Such traits are not rare among repeat offenders. They indicate familiarity with intrusion and possibly desensitization to risk. However, there was no body. The defense argued that the fingerprint could have been left during earlier legitimate work on the property. Prosecutors initially declined to file charges. This moment is crucial. The justice system requires certainty beyond suspicion. A fingerprint suggests presence. It does not, by itself, establish timing or intent. The absence of remains created a barrier that the legal threshold could not easily overcome. Suspicion is not sufficient. If we examine the inferred behavioral pattern of the offender, several elements stand out. Before the crime, he may have been familiar with the property. He may have noticed the accessible window. We do not know whether he conducted deliberate surveillance, but the entry point was specific and quiet. During the crime, the removal appears controlled. There was no excessive destruction, no reports of shouting, no attempt to disable multiple household systems. The act was focused and contained. After the crime, there was no contact with the family, no ransom demand, no communication. The suspect, if indeed responsible, continued other criminal behavior elsewhere. That continuation suggests compartmentalization, the psychological ability to separate violent acts from daily functioning. Perhaps the most unsettling dimension is not brutality. It is normalcy after violence. The possibility that someone could enter a child's bedroom, remove her silently, and return to routine life without outward disruption. From small behavioral details, unplugging a fan, removing a screen carefully, not waking adults, we observe a pattern of controlled intrusion. It suggests motivation rooted in access and dominance rather than spectacle or chaos. The crime was intimate in proximity, but emotionally detached in execution. And that detachment is often the clearest psychological signal in cases like this. If Chapter 2 was about what we can reconstruct, and Chapter 3 about what behavior suggests, this chapter is about what remains absent. In cold cases, absence is not empty space. It is information. The record does not simply fail to speak. It speaks through silence. The most significant absence in this case was the missing body. For decades, no remains were recovered. That fact reshaped every dimension of the investigation. For the family, it meant suspended grief. Without physical confirmation, loss becomes indefinite. There is no place to visit, no ritual that feels complete. Psychologically, this creates what clinicians often describe as ambiguous loss. The mind oscillates between hope and acceptance. Closure is delayed not because of denial, but because evidence is incomplete. For prosecutors, the absence created a legal barrier. In homicide cases, the body often anchors the narrative. It establishes cause of death. It establishes manner. It narrows timeline. Without it, every argument requires inference layered upon inference. Jurors are asked to believe a chain that cannot be fully demonstrated. That hesitation is not weakness. It is the structure of due process. For the community, the missing body left the story unresolved. Rumors grow more easily when facts are scarce. The record is silent on where the child was taken. It is silent on how she died. It is silent on her final hours. That silence becomes part of the case itself. Turning to evidence constraints, we must place ourselves back in the 1980s. Cigarette butts recovered near the window could not be analyzed for DNA in the way we might expect today. Fingerprint databases were far more limited and slower to process. Forensic preservation standards, while professional, did not anticipate future technological breakthroughs. Interagency communication required phone calls, mailed documents, and time. It suggests not that the offender was exceptionally brilliant, but that the system lacked tools we now consider standard. Investigators were working within the limits of their era. We often judge older cases through modern expectations. That perspective can distort analysis. The interpersonal strain between the mother and local law enforcement added further complexity. A recorded call captured frustration. Allegations of neglect surfaced publicly. Years later, the sheriff faced unrelated legal troubles that fueled retrospective doubt. Public trust influences investigative momentum. When confidence erodes, cooperation may weaken. Political tension can stall collaboration between agencies. But we must be cautious here. Institutional imperfection does not equal conspiracy. Often, it reflects limited resources, human fatigue, competing priorities, and the emotional toll of working unsolved cases. Cold cases rarely freeze overnight. They cool gradually. How does that cooling happen? It happens when leads fail to produce confirmation. It happens when prosecutors determine evidence is insufficient. It happens when technology has not yet caught up to suspicion. It happens when procedural caution outweighs urgency. A cold case is not always the result of a clever killer orchestrating flawless evasion. More often, it emerges from structural limits interacting with incomplete data. Investigators may believe they know the likely offender, but belief does not equal proof. In this case, the offender did not need to outsmart the entire system. He only needed to operate within its gaps. The absence of a body, the limitations of forensic science, and the high legal threshold for prosecution formed a narrow corridor through which doubt could pass. That corridor allowed time to accumulate, and time, in criminal investigation, changes everything. Memories fade, evidence degrades, personnel retire, political climates shift, the silence deepens. Understanding how a case becomes cold requires humility. It requires recognizing that systems are human constructs, bound by technology, law, and trust. The making of a cold case is rarely dramatic. It is incremental, procedural, structural, and in that structure, uncertainty becomes embedded. That is not failure alone. It is reality within constraint. Cold cases do not remain frozen forever. Sometimes they thaw gradually, as personnel change and evidence is reconsidered through a new lens. In this case, decades after the disappearance, a new sheriff took office. The file was reopened. The FBI joined the effort. Old evidence was re-examined, not because it had changed, but because perspective had. The fingerprint recovered from the exterior glass decades earlier was reviewed again. A prior jailhouse confession, once dismissed as insufficient without corroboration, was reassessed. Relatives and acquaintances of the suspect described subtle behavioral shifts after the child disappeared. They reported that he altered his appearance, shaving his beard and abandoning the tall hat he was known to wear. He smoked the same brand of cigarettes found near the window that night. None of these elements alone resolved the case, but collectively, they formed a pattern strong enough to present to a jury. Eventually, there was an arrest. A trial followed. After deliberation, a conviction was secured. The sentence was life in prison. From a legal standpoint, the system functioned, evidence was presented, arguments were made, a verdict was rendered. The case, formally, was no longer open, and yet resolution has layers. No remains were ever recovered. There was no full reconstruction of the child's final hours. There was no publicly detailed confession that explained the sequence from entry to death. The conviction rested on circumstantial evidence and testimony evaluated through the standards of law. That standard was met, but narrative completeness was not. Technology and persistence provided a name. They did not provide a complete story. It suggests that justice can be procedural without being emotionally restorative. A courtroom can determine guilt. It cannot restore what was taken, nor can it fill every silence left in the record. For the family, emotions were complex. Relief and grief often coexist. Validation that suspicion was not misplaced can bring a measure of steadiness. But decades of ambiguous loss do not dissolve in a single verdict. The absence of remains, the unanswered questions about suffering and final moments, continue to exist outside the courtroom's reach. For the community, the case was formally closed. The narrative arc, at least publicly, had an endpoint. Yet narrative gaps remain. The image of an intact bed and an empty space does not change because of a sentencing hearing. What do we know with certainty? A child was taken from her bed. A man entered quietly. Evidence pointed toward a suspect. A jury delivered a verdict. What do we not know? We do not know what she experienced after leaving that house. We do not know her final words. We do not know the full internal state of the offender on that night, whether he felt calculation,
Compulsion? Detachment? Or something else entirely? And that uncertainty matters.
The value of analyzing a case like this does not lie solely in identifying a perpetrator. It lies in understanding how fragile systems, human psychology, and incomplete records intersect. It reminds us that violence can coexist with ordinary life. That proximity does not guarantee safety. That procedure does not erase pain. Most importantly, it teaches us something about ambiguity. Some questions remain unanswered, even after conviction. Some silences persist even after justice is declared. We learn not only about crime, but about limits of knowledge, of memory, of institutions, and perhaps we learn that confronting those limits honestly is part of what it means to pursue truth with respect rather than spectacle. The story ends in a courtroom, but the quiet of that bedroom remains.